All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Art Museum of West Virginia University's Lunchtime Looks program. We're very pleased to have you here. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Betsy Osborne. Betsy is a service assistant professor for the School of Education and the Department of History, serving as the program coordinator for the Secondary Social Studies program. Prior to this appointment, Osborne spent over a decade teaching social studies in Virginia in a middle school classroom. That's a brave soul. Within academia, her research centers on challenging established norms and disrupting entrenched narratives in social studies education. So she is going to take us on a journey today to look at this work by Gregory Gillespie from our exhibition Where the Wind Blows, selections from the collection 1960 to 1975. All right, thank you very much, Betsy.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. I will admittedly state that I am nervous, but as Cicero says, all speaking of merit is characterized by nervousness, so I feel a little bit better. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for the invite to come speak. I am a humble teacher and come to you from a middle school classroom in Virginia, where I spent half of my time teaching civics, and the latter part of my years I spent teaching U.S. history from 1865 to present day. So I was very excited to come talk about a time period which I had at least historical knowledge of, so that was pretty nice. Underneath you all is a clipboard that is something that we would use in a social studies classroom, and I modified this from Harvard's Project Zero classroom. I modified it by adding some directions and some supports for students that help them to understand what it is they're asked to do in those certain columns. So I invite you all, while normally I would make this really interactive and hands-on and ask for questions, but we are limited on time. So while I'm speaking, if you are intrigued by this piece, you're asked to look. You don't have to, but if you'd like to, there are certain things that we ask social studies students to do when they're looking at what we call primary source. To see something, so you would look and say, okay, here's what I can see. Here's something that's visible to me. What do I think? This is where you can start making some more assumptions about what it is that you're looking at in the piece. And then the last section is my favorite, which is the wonder. We call this a see, think, wonder analysis sheet. And so the wonder piece really dives into where we allow students intrigue and inquiry to really live. So as I'm speaking, if you are bored or want to doodle, you're welcome to come look at this piece and to fill out this see, think, wonder, which I'll reference a couple times when we speak. So thank you again. I am Betsy Osborne and a recent graduate of the PhD program in educational theory and practice at WVU. My research, my dissertation topic it was a phenomenological study. I don't know if anyone knows phenomenology, but that's why I really like this piece. It's a phenomenological study that focused on social studies teachers and how they chose to disrupt whiteness in their classroom and what manifested to lead them to want to do that in their classroom. And as a social studies and very critically minded person, I'm really driven into making sure that my work can elevate historically marginalized and historically silenced groups of people. And a big commitment to me as a former teacher is to make sure that my work can trickle down into the classroom. So I really appreciate this space because you all get to see ways in which we can use social studies to be disruptive of particularly like white supremacist ideologies in social studies curriculum. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. When Dr. Harris asked me to come speak, I was really anxious because I thought to myself, I don't have an art history scholarship. I don't have much art history background. I don't know art. I just like pictures. And so I was really anxious. And when she brought me in here to this exhibit, I was instantly drawn to this particular piece right here. This is the work of Gregory Gillespie. This piece was done in 1971, and it followed his fellowship where he did some training in Italy and some study abroad work. And his coming back to the United States, he produced this piece in 71. And I particularly was drawn to this piece because it's a realist piece, which gives us the perspective of someone's household. It's called the hall corner in the Graves house. And so I notably, also when I was doing my research on Gillespie, his work doesn't often fit nicely into categories, which I think is why I gravitated to him so nicely as well. His work doesn't fit nicely into realist photographs, but his work often did center on really meticulous focuses in his design. So for example, you'll notice that what looks like a torn piece of canvas is actually just his layering of paint and art to make it look like it's torn. Actually, Dr. Harris said, it's not ripped, because I asked, I was like, is it ripped? And she said, nope. Cool. So what I really was drawn to this piece about was this allegory that you're seeing of the late 1960s and early 70s in this time period. And I don't know if you all can see it as easily back there, but once you get closer, you can see he's got subtle hints. I call them little Easter eggs inside of this piece that kind of hint to what the time period was like. For example, you can see, if you look really carefully, what looks like bullet casings underneath the birdhouse next to a shoe. I've yet to figure out what the shoe means. I'm really diving into that one. But you've got these subtle hints as to what the time period was like for him. And he was also known in some of his early pieces. He did a lot of work that represented photographs, and he layered photography on top of his own pieces. Often he'd pull them from magazines or family photographs. So I'm not an art scholar, but I wonder if this was a nod to his interest in photography. I see a head nod, so cool, I'll take that as a yes. All right, so when I was looking at this piece in particular, I was really drawn to it because I take in my own life and my own work a phenomenological mindset, which is really a tricky word to say. But I like to pay attention to things that people don't normally pay attention to. I like to see things that are often invisible to people. So when I walked up to this piece, I thought, okay, that's cool. But when I got closer to it, I started asking a lot of questions. A true phenomenologist will walk away with more questions when they leave than when they start. So I walked away with several pieces here. The thing that I am really stuck on, and I spent about 3 hours yesterday trying to figure this out, is this particular piece right here, this little photograph. So if anyone has any insight, it's very welcomed. You can see, if you can look really carefully, what looks like a collection of young women wearing, I can't figure out if it's period swimsuits or time frames of gymnastics or dance. I can't tell. So I walk away from this piece wanting to learn more, and that's something that I'm deeply connected to. So my noticings, what do I notice? Well, the first thing that I tended to look at was there's a shoe in the yard. Why is there a shoe in the yard? There's no doorknob on what looks like a potential door. I just moved into a home, well, 6 years ago, but I moved into a 1902 Craftsman, and I noticed that this picture has high baseboards. My personal lived experience drew me to those high baseboards because it's something I'm familiar with. I also have 2 young children who make my walls really dirty and like to hang up artwork. So I wonder what inspiration was pulled in here. Were there children in his home, in his life, or in this particular perspective? But the thing that Dr. Harris also pointed out that made me go, oh my goodness, and I'm trying to read into this a little bit, maybe too much, but you notice that the picture has what looks like a sunset in the background, but if you're looking at the way the shadow is being cast on the wall, it comes from a different direction. So I was led to wonder, is this his artistic way of describing this black-white scenario that our world was being cast upon during this time period of the late 60s and early 70s? Is that his nod to that particular time? So obviously my eyes are drawn to the pictures on the wall, and this picture right here really left me wondering. So if this is 1971, I was paying attention to the color of people's skin. I noticed that it looks like an integrated group of Girl Scouts. So I did some digging. Thank you, Dr. Harris also pointed me in a good direction towards Action 70. So during this time period, there was a significant amount of racial tension in the United States. And particularly, there was a time that the Kearns report had just come out. That came out after some pretty significant rioting that occurred in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit that left 69 people dead. And there were 23 other cities across the United States that were seeing similar patterns of behavior. So the Kearns report came out, and as a result, the Girl Scouts decided to take a stance and say, we are an organization that doesn't appreciate and like this movement. So they wrote a letter to the White House and said, we've got to do better as a nation. And people praised them for taking that stand, and they put their actions into effect. They created what was called the Friendship Committee. Oh, there it was. The Friendship Committee, which allowed people to come together from different Girl Scout troops to intentionally integrate a camp where they would go camping, they would go they'd play games, they would go do service projects, they would bounce ideas off of each other. And most notably, they did an incredibly cool service project where they traveled to polish the brass at the carousel in Glen Echoes Park, which was a significant gesture because that was a predominantly white space. And it was, for a long history of the carousel, was a white-only location. So it was an intentional act to kind of push back against that time. So I have to think that Gillespie really did draw upon that when he was putting that in there, made that an intentional move. But you also see the lunar module. I'm assuming what would be in a lunar module. So we know that there was a space race going on, and the United States landed on the moon July 20th, 1969, around the time that this piece was being brought forward. So maybe that's a nod to the space race. And then back to that bullet casing. I'm really curious what direction that was led and why there was a bullet casing there. What did he mean by that? Was it to reference the civil unrest that was going on, the death of Malcolm X in 1965 and the death of Martin Luther King, the assassination of both of these men, Martin Luther King being in 1968? Was that a nod to that moment? Or was it a nod to the Vietnam War? Because I will admittedly say I don't have a very strong knowledge of guns, but it looks like something that would come, it's a pretty large casing. It looks like something that would come out of a military style weapon. So was that a nod to the Vietnam War, where we saw the highest death rate in 1968 and then having the largest number of service people drafted, which was like 543,000 people? Yes, sir. In what year? 67? So I learned, I knew, but I was wondering, was that a nod to what was happening during that time period where we saw this huge wave of people? So you're seeing the late 1960s and 1970s really coming through in a lot of different ways. Again, that allegory of that time period that I think is really fascinating. So when I see this piece, and that obviously pulled me in and was really interesting because I kept going, oh, wait, what about this? What does that stick mean? And she's like, it might just be a stick. But I'm like, well, it's got to mean something. So I think that kind of draw really speaks to what we can do in the classroom. If I'm a teacher who has this pretty survey level knowledge of US history, how can we use this piece to allow students to connect and to really dive in? So I was telling Dr. Harris when she first invited me how powerful an experience I had when I was in my second year of teaching. I participated in a grant called the Teach for American History grant, which brought teachers from all over the country to Philadelphia, and we went to the art museum. And there I learned how to really use art to drive inquiry and intrigue in our classrooms. And it was this mind-blowing opportunity because at that moment I recognized what a gateway art could be. It bridges content and student perspective and student understanding. And it mirrors a lot, if we use the right tools and the right mediums, it can mirror a lot of their own lived experiences that they have as students and as young adults. So when I did this particular activity, I also came from the perspective of someone who was a struggling reader growing up. I recognized how art could be a way for students to try to understand something without having to read something. I think of my grandparents who came to the United States, well, their parents came to the United States, who came with zero English, and how political cartoons were such an instrumental tool in helping them to understand what was happening in the climate of the United States at the time. And I think art really does that important work for our students. When I was in the classroom, I particularly liked to focus on historically silenced and marginalized voices. So I would intentionally fill my walls with pictures and artwork not of white people. And the only two people that were, I take that back, there were two people in there. There was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then there was a woman who identified as a woman who was a trans woman. So I had all of this art on my wall, using it as a space to push back against that narrative. But when I look at how I intentionally used it more directly in the classroom, and I made students engage in it, I did a couple of things. Because I was in a time period that the historic preservation of art started to mirror how society was shifting, I liked to pull, one piece that I used in particular was Jacob Lawrence's The Great Migration series. And so students learned about, while we were talking about the migration of African Americans or formerly enslaved individuals who had lived in the South, they learned about that progress to the North through his artwork, and how it wasn't always as seemingly, okay, we've crossed the Mason-Dixon, racism doesn't exist anymore. His artwork did an excellent job of helping students understand that and to build those connections. Some other things that I did was I used to use art a lot to start a unit. I used to call them my hooks, because it allowed me to do what's called a pre-assessment, where I would say, okay, what do you see here? What are you noticing? And it allowed me to say, okay, cool, I don't have to teach that content because they clearly already know it. And it was a safe space for students to try, and it was a really safe space for students to fail, because none of them were art experts. And so if they didn't do it correctly, it wasn't a spot where people felt like, oh no, the spotlight's on me, I didn't say that right, when, I mean, I barely knew the art itself myself. So I really liked as well to use it to showcase diversity and culture. I used it oftentimes in station work. When it came to final assessments on final assessments, I let students do their own artistic rendering with some parameters of this time period. I had a student one time do an amazing sculpture of something, but I partnered that activity with, okay, how do you see these particular things in this piece? So it was a really helpful way to reach different styles of learners at that same time as well. One of my favorite strategies to teach and to do is what we used to call photograph or picture statues. And so we'd take a picture from the time period and we'd project it on the wall or on the board, and the students would come up and they would freeze. The kids loved, and pardon me, I'm gonna squat for a second. They would love to do the ones where they had to be in weird poses, because they would freeze for several minutes and then they'd start complaining, and I'd be like, oh, you can't talk. So students would freeze in the image of the people on the wall, and then I'd come touch them and they'd come to life. And when they came to life, they shared the narrative of the people that were in the photograph. They didn't have to know a lot about them, but they could pretend and they could use what they'd learned by learning through the content and hearing our stories to bring this person's voice to action. And then the students in the classroom got to ask questions. So it was a wonderful way to take something that is a single image and make it come to life. And so for me, I thought that was really, really critical. I also used what you all have in front of you. I used art as a primary source. This is a primary source of the time period. So students would take art and they would have to complete a See, Think, Wonder. Why I like the See, Think, Wonder activity is because it's giving students empowerment to try. It's not like doing some sort of document analysis where there is a right or wrong answer. This is them diving in and wanting to learn more and asking questions. For example, I see a bullet casing. I think it's probably referencing the Vietnam War. Is there a relationship, this is the wonder piece, is there a relationship between the shoe and a birdhouse or the bird feeder, what is there a relationship with? So then students would take that question and then they'd go and they'd look it up. They'd go try to find those answers, which is why I think this piece really speaks so perfectly to the ways we can use art in the classroom. And so again, back to this imposter syndrome of coming and standing in front of you all as not an art scholar. I was led, when I walked away from our conversation, where Dr. Harris is like, that's the point, like we want to bring in different perspectives. I started thinking about what type of art did I, with my own perspective and bias, bring into the classroom. I brought in photographs. I brought in realist style pictures because for students it was something tangible. They could see history, they could see it, they could believe it. And even though I would love to say that we all have they all were abstract thinkers, this was something that gave them, okay, this happened, and here's some, I hate to say proof, but here's some truth and some evidence of this happening. I like to think about what Eisenhower said, and I'm about to say a bad word, I apologize. You might want to bleep this out later. But Eisenhower, when he was documenting the liberation of concentration camps, he stated, get it on record now. Get the film, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road, history, some bastards will get up and say that it never happened. Sorry about that. But that is what I think art can do for our students. And so now that I'm in this role as a teacher educator, of course I teach them the picture statues, and yes, I get college students to freeze in weird poses, but I also teach them the more philosophical side of teaching. How can we use art to disrupt the normalization of social studies content? How do we take John Gast's picture of American progress and show them this is what normalizing looks like? You see, do you all know what I'm talking about, that piece? It's the one that's typically referred to as Manifest Destiny, where there's an angel floating across. And you see the dark, which is the indigenous tribes and the native people being pushed off their land. Dark and normalizing in social studies is typically referred to as something bad. Where you see the light, which brings in the railroads and white settlers and the phone lines. You see all of these pieces moving through. Oh, thanks. I probably should have sent that to you earlier. So we use that to say, this is what our content does, and this is why we need to point out to our students how society takes and normalizes our work and our thinking. We also use photography to disrupt heroification, how we ask students to zoom into a photograph and to see all the great stuff that this person did for our society, but to also zoom out and recognize how we as a society have this imperfect person in an imperfect society. So they are wonderful people, but we have to recognize they were human beings with flaws and errors. And last but not least, we really encourage, especially in my courses, to use art of all mediums, music, film, photographs, artwork, paintings, to use as primary sources so that students aren't stuck in this cycle of having to read and read and read, because art can come off the page and speak to them just as loudly. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osborne. Is my microphone okay? All right. So with that, we are going to take some time for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes for people to ask Dr. Osborne questions about her work or this work and everything she talked about today. I'm going to bring the microphone to you because we are recording for our video archive. So we want to get your voice on audio. Anybody have any questions? All right, question from the back.
She's putting you to work.
Okay, it's not really a question, but I did notice something. You said that there wasn't a doorknob on the door. On the lower right, is that supposed to be a doorstop in the shape of a doorknob?
I don't know. Listen, I looked for hinges. I looked for, could there be another door coming in from another angle? I don't know. I saw that too. There's a doorstop without hinges and without a doorknob. Good eye. Good eye.
And I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me about this piece. And I think I read you a quote from an art critic about this kind of surrealist element. And you've talked about the bullet casing, and I led you in that direction. But certain people have looked at that and seen a cigarette, a scrap of paper. So there could be other things. But my question to you is also, how do we balance? And I'm going to give you one that I think about as a gallery educator. How do we balance the impetus of art to engage student perspectives, but then also honoring when they don't want to talk about the history of this and they think the shoe is and the weird light is a sign of an alien abduction or something, because I've had that happen.
Yep.
So how do you kind of balance that ability of art to bring in the perspectives, but also honoring that could be an interpretation of this artwork, but it's not headed in a social studies or historical direction?
Well, that's a solid question, because I still wonder about the shoe, and who knows, it could have been a reference to something. I think the answer to that lies in how we ask students to question and what we do with those questions. One of the things that my mentor, when I was going through my teacher training, pushed us to say is always dig in to find deeper, and to always set up a classroom. And this is kind of jumping outside of art, but more into like the structure of fostering of a community in a classroom. It has to start with how you generate the common good of the students in the room. If you create an atmosphere where a student can say, I think could this be an alien abduction? Well, I don't know. It very well could be. That could be the UFO flying away. If you don't generate a space where students feel comfortable asking those questions, and that takes a lot of work, they're not going to ask it. So it's what you do with the questions that they've given you, and then how you've created a culture in the classroom where students feel comfortable asking that question, so that then you can dig in deeper. And the other thing that I really appreciate about when we use art, because it is an interpretive medium, you're not wrong. And so if you take that mindset, and that's a hard thing to also do, because I'm going to want to say that that's Action 70, but it might not be. But if you go in with that, almost that humility, maybe is the right word, but also the ability to say, no question is wrong. No one's going to be wrong here. It allows that student to be empowered, to want to learn more, and maybe they will stop and go do the research to dig in and try to find more about that piece. So if you create that right atmosphere, and you create a space where they'll want to ask questions, hopefully that intrigue and inquiry will lead them to want to take action next. Was that okay?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Great.
Cool.
Any other questions? Yeah, Jacob.
This is less of a question, but I just want to have an appreciation of you choosing this piece, because when I first saw it, it's a very interesting piece, and it really kind of brought my attention. And hearing your thoughts on it, and hearing the history behind it, because I didn't do any research. I just really saw it and just had initial feelings. But seeing the history behind it, it's very interesting, and I'm glad you chose this.
Thank
for
you.
the future.
I don't know if any of that's accurate, and that's also important to lead. Let me also state back to that question: when you go into these spaces, this is the humility piece. If you come in acting all-knowing, it shuts down the possibility for other truths to be available. So like you said, it could be a piece of paper. But if you come in saying, I think this is what it is, as an educator, you're also modeling the ways in which we want students to be critical and questioning of things. So I appreciate that, because I don't know the history accurate, I know the time period and what was happening, and I can make that assumption. But that's how it's a really cool way to use art to allow students to also think, oh, I see it. Here's this person doing the same thing. So I might be totally wrong.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that we're always grappling with in this interpretive frame, is there is this historical moment where these things were happening, with the space race, with the Girl Scouts, with integration. And all of that we have record of, but there's also a way to kind of interpret what all of that means through an artistic lens, as Gillespie has done, and ask questions about why he was making those choices as an artist, which is where we get into art criticism and art history and artistic theory as well. So it's that intersection of those disciplines.
And you better believe I did a Google search of this particular piece and there's nothing. I was like, I chose the wrong one. But that's what makes it safe. That's kind of that space that I was speaking of earlier. It's safe to make these mistakes. So thank you for no one throwing fruit at me. It's not allowed in here anyways, but thanks for not throwing me up against it.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.
you.
This was really, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
This was really powerful for me as an educator as well, and I really appreciate you owning that discomfort of me asking you to talk about art, because that's really what we aim for this program to do, is to bring folks from across campus to show us that art can be a lens into all sorts of perspectives and all sorts of disciplines, and really an entry point and a way in. So I really thank you for highlighting that and owning the discomfort and then walking through it to be here with us today. We really
Absolutely.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
The next iteration of this series will be on the first Friday in April, April 5th, with Dan Saffel, who is the director of the West Virginia University Press and who has a graphic design background. So he's going to be talking a little bit about some of this abstract art from this time period as it relates to book cover design. So that's another interesting interdisciplinary lens that we're going to look at. So please join us. That will be in our upstairs gallery at 12 noon on April 5th, and we hope you join us for that as well. Thank you for being here today. The galleries are now open. You can enjoy the rest of the exhibition here and upstairs. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks.